Welcome back to the channel, everybody. It's a nice snowy day here in Colorado, and Ries the Shop Dog couldn't be having more fun. So with this weather, I think it's a good time to talk about the history of all 15 different Land Cruiser generations, which are across the 3 different series that Toyota still produces today. I wanted to put this video together because although there are Land Cruiser history videos out there, they mainly just cover the modern day SUV that was discontinued in 2021 for North America. As a result, I don't think most Americans even know about the modern day J70 or the Land Cruiser Prado that us North Americans are getting in 2024. So that's why I figured this is a good time to do one of those videos, so let's get right into it. So let's do some research. Wikipedia is a bit confusing. The main page covers the heavy duty and station wagon series, but then Wikipedia has its own page for the J40, the J70, and then next there's also a link that goes to what are called the light duty series models. So now you decide to maybe browse the Australian Toyota website just to find out that when you go to SUVs, here it is. There's the Prado, and then there's the Land Cruiser 300. But then if you go to this section, you also find the Land Cruiser 70, and it's surprisingly a pickup truck. What? We don't even have that in America, so what exactly is this? Well, to clear up my own confusion, I made a flow chart showing how the Japanese Willys Jeep became the 3 different Land Cruisers that you can purchase today. Yes, I know it's PowerPoint flowchart, but just trust me here for a second. It goes through the entire history, and I could not have made it any more clear. The first generation Land Cruiser started in 1951, which was 73 years ago. But to understand the first generation, we're going to have to rewind another 15 years to 1936. At this time, the Japanese Army introduced the Kurogane Type 95 4-wheel drive reconnaissance car. Very interesting design, and it kind of reminds me of an off-road VW Beetle. But apparently the Japanese Army didn't care for their cute buggy because during 1941, the Japanese captured an American Willys Jeep in the Philippines. The Japanese copied the Jeep and created the prototype Model AK. Then 1 year later, in 1942, they created the AK-10, which had the same engine as the Model AE sedan. No, not that one, but this one. Not that it really matters because the year is now 1950. The United States military has Japan occupied and they are preparing for the Korean War. So with the demand for the Willys Jeep, the US government sourced locally in Japan and tasked Toyota to build more Jeeps using the Willys specs and requirements. And then 1 year later, Toyota manufactures the Toyota Jeep BJ. And this is where we can go back to the flowchart and begin the first generation of the heavy duty series. From 1951 to 1955, the BJ-FJ was being produced for US and Japanese government purposes. And by the way, the B and the F that you see is just denoting the type of engine that Land Cruiser had. You'll see this throughout the Land Cruiser history. By 1954, Willys was ready to sue because Toyota was using the Jeep brand. So Toyota changed the name to Land Cruiser. This was by design in order to compete with the British Land Rover, which again is how the first generation of Land Cruiser name started. Now it's 1955, the second gen Land Cruiser has been released and it's called the J20. It was designed to have more civilian appeal and it saw success in exploration, mining, construction, and firefighting, which led to a multitude of different types of J20s depending on its use case. Now, if you're an American like me, you need to keep this in mind. The heavy duty series, which most Americans are unfamiliar with, has always had many different models, and that's still the way it is today with the J70. That's why you saw that pickup truck. Now, knowing that, in 1957, Australia contracted out about 60 J20 station wagons for a specific mining company. This led to a really unique station wagon called the FJ35. I call this unique because even though it's called the FJ35, it's still part of the J20 generation. And as a result, there's actually no J30 generation. So if anyone knows why Toyota went with the FJ35 for this specific J20, please comment below because there's very limited information online for why they did this. And finally, one more important note for the J20 is that the first American J20 was sold in 1958. You can actually find that FJ25 at the Land Cruiser Heritage Museum on full display. Like I said, that was the 1958 Land Cruiser, and now you know why the 2024 Land Cruiser in America that's coming out this summer has a trim type called the 1958 Special Edition. Let's move to 1960. The J20 only saw 5 years of production before the third generation J40 came out. But this Land Cruiser stayed in production for 24 full years and is responsible for the Land Cruiser that we know today. Again, the J40 had many different models from a short wheelbase to a long wheelbase, but the most important variation was the long wheelbase FJ45 station wagon. Because by the early 1960s, the off-road wagon started to become very popular in North America as a family vehicle. After all, this was the decade responsible for the Suburban, the Jeep Wagoneer, and the Bronco. So Toyota recognized this market opportunity and it actually ended the FJ45 in 1967 so they could rebrand it as its own product line. And that product line was the J50, and it's the first generation of Land Cruiser station wagons. These station wagons are what most of us know today as the Land Cruiser SUV. But before I go into that history, I just want to finish the heavy duty series so I don't have to bounce between multiple series of Land Cruisers. So the J40 stayed in production as the heavy duty work vehicle for 24 years until 1984. This is when another redesign happened and we get the fourth generation heavy duty Land Cruiser called the J70. The J70 was released in 1984, and just like the previous Land Cruisers, it had many different models depending on what you needed it for. You still had your pickups and your troop carriers, but the most notable of these models was basically a short wheel based wagon, which was called the J70 Lite. This saw a lot of popularity in European and Asian large cities because the J50 and the J60 station wagons were just too big to navigate through those cities. So Toyota now saw another opportunity. They decided to make the J70 Lite its own brand, which now marks the beginning of a third parallel series called the Light Duty series. That Land Cruiser is called the Prado, and its lineage is actually responsible for the 2024 Land Cruiser that we're going to start seeing in North America. But before starting that history, let's finish up the heavy duties. So like I said, in 1990, the J70 Lite went away and now it's its own generation, but that still leaves the rest of the J70 models and platforms to continue to be produced even to this day. So like it says right there, 1984 to present day. So if we scroll all the way down through this timeline, you can actually see that the J70 in Australia, in the Middle East, it is still being produced as a work truck and commercial truck, and also a vehicle that people can use if they want to do off-roading trips. So this is a very successful SUV, very successful truck, and that's 40 years of a single generation of Land Cruiser. Now, of course, it's not the same vehicle. It has gone through a number of refreshes to keep up with the times, but hear me out, it's still the same J70. If you browse Toyota Australia, you can actually build your own 2024 J70. These days, you can still get the wagon, you can purchase that troop carrier version, and then they have the two different types of Land Cruiser pickup trucks you can buy. Even this pickup truck, it's got a few different colors. It has a manual transmission and that 4.5 liter turbo diesel still equipped in this J70. Now, as cool as these things look, they are not meant for daily driving. Just take a look at the interior of the modern J70. It's very basic design meant for commercial and work use. And even with the exterior, it's not too comfortable. The truck still has leaf springs for that rear suspension system and still a solid front axle. Great for work, great for off-roading, not great for daily driving. Also, don't expect to listen to any music or podcasts because you'll be listening to the engine and wind noise most of the time. If you want to see a full tour of the modern day J70, check out this video by CarSauce. I think they do a really good job breaking down the features for those of us not familiar with the modern day J70. Now, that pretty much covers everything for the heavy duty series, so go ahead and comment below if you have any thoughts on this segment before we start moving on to the station wagon series. Okay, let's go back to the 1960s. Recall that the station wagon now has its own brand called the J50. Interestingly enough, the J50 is the only Land Cruiser to have a rear window that retracted into the tailgate. I think this is something most people recognize as a feature for the Toyota 4Runner, but that was actually first done by the J50. The J50 saw 13 years of success until the next generation came out in 1980. That's the release of the J60.
last, the legend goes turbo. Because you never know when you'll need Land Cruiser Turbo Power. Direct injection makes it the most powerful vehicle in its class. The power, the performance, and the handling that puts you in control.
Direct injection turbo? What a charge!
Turbo Power.
The J60, in my opinion, is where the Land Cruiser really started to take on that more aggressive SUV look. The J60 was equipped with more luxury features for its time. Things like air conditioning, air vents for the rear passengers, and a more decorated interior. The engine also had 135 horsepower, which was upgraded to 155 horses in 1988. Regardless of its success during the 80s, the next generation was made, and it arrived in 1990. That generation is none other than the J80. If you browse any Land Cruiser fan club or forum, you'll find that the J80 is widely considered as the greatest Land Cruiser. The J80 was still true to its roots of being a very reliable and highly functional off-road vehicle, but at the same time, it still had enough comfort creatures to separate it from the heavy-duty J70. For example, this was the start of all-wheel drive in the Land Cruisers. ABS was also introduced, and for power it had 212 horsepower, which was almost 60 units more than the last generation. The J80 was also the first Land Cruiser to have a Lexus equivalent called the LX450. Even though there are some differences, they are very, very similar, so if you're shopping around for a J80, maybe even consider the LX450. Also, as a quick note, anytime there's a Lexus equivalent to the Land Cruiser, I'll make sure I place it somewhere on the screen. So overall, the J80 is a classic in the Land Cruiser cult, and no surprise that Joe Rogan's post-apocalyptic custom-built Land Cruiser is actually a J80. Icon built that J80, and you can find their video in the description box below. Towards the end of their video, they say they put over 3,000 man-hours just into that build. Another video I recommend for the J80 if you want more details is the Car Care Nuts video on the J80, also in the description box below. But this is a history video, we're not going to go into that much detail, so let's go ahead and move on to the next Land Cruiser, which is the J100. The year is 1998, you're probably watching Dragon Ball Z on Toonami, and Toyota just released the J100 Land Cruiser. The J100 was sold internationally, and it now had a wider chassis, a new V8 engine with 235 horsepower, and the first Land Cruiser to have independent front suspensions to improve road handling. But the negative with that is it limits articulation when off-roading. That is part of the reason why many Land Cruiser enthusiasts say this Land Cruiser was the start to when Toyota decided to shift the model to a luxury SUV. However, the J100 is still an amazing vehicle. If the J80 is primarily an off-roader and then after that a luxury family vehicle, the J100 is a really good balance between the two, and if I had to pick one generation to daily drive and then also weekend warrior, it would probably be the J100. Sure, it's not as rugged or capable as the J80, but you can still take your kids to school with the J100, be comfortable, and then on the weekends go hit plenty of difficult trails. So overall, even though the J100 doesn't have that same cult following as the J80, it's still a very good Land Cruiser, a very successful one, and I would say it does live up to its brand name. But now the year is 2008. You're probably playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and the J200 is now being released. Sadly, the J200 was quickly criticized for being overly developed to fit the expectations of an SUV in the modern age. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. If the J80 was off-road first and then family-friendly second, and then the J100 was a good balance between the two, the J200 was definitely a luxury family-friendly vehicle first and then an off-roading vehicle second. Although it has a more powerful V8 engine, it introduced KDSS to the Land Cruiser, which most enthusiasts would likely just remove from their rig. And it also came with additional luxury features like smart entry, push to start, and then multi-terrain selections when driving. Now I know what you're thinking, just because the J200 started adding luxury features doesn't necessarily mean it can't off-road. Well, yes, I agree with you on that, but here's the problem. People just didn't do it. And if you ask yourself, why weren't people using this SUV as an off-roader? In my opinion, it's because of the price. Before discontinuing in North America in 2021, it had an MSRP of $80,000, and I think that's the problem. You have to be a little bit crazy to seriously off-road such an expensive SUV. I mean, honestly, who would do such a thing? So let's do a quick experiment just on the price creep. Check out this 1992 MSRP of the J80 and let's compare it to the 1992 4Runner for the same exact year. And now the 2021 MSRP of the J200 Land Cruiser, and let's compare that to a 2021 4Runner. Making that comparison is making it more obvious that all these luxury features have slowly blown up the price of the Land Cruiser, and I think that's part of the reason why it failed in North America. But regardless of how it failed or why it failed in North America, the J100 still saw plenty of success internationally, especially in places like the Middle East. I still remember my days in Kuwait and Qatar seeing flashing high beams in my rearview mirror, which basically meant, hey, move over to the shoulder, I'm going 120 miles per hour in my Land Cruiser and you're in my way. Now, regardless of where it saw or did not see success, Toyota still produced the next generation in 2022. Its present day in the current Land Cruiser is called the J300. This is not offered in North America unless you purchase the Lexus version called the LX600, which is right around $100,000, so good luck getting that. But if you're in Australia or the Middle East, you can actually still purchase the J300, but this price still stands around $100,000. I'm sure it's going to sell well, a lot of people are still going to like it, so I'm excited to see how it does for the next couple of years. And that's the J300, not much to talk about since it just came out, and that's also the history of the station wagon series that most of us know and love. What was once the king of off-roading recreation is now an extremely expensive luxury SUV, but the history doesn't end there. We still need to go back to 1990 and talk about the light-duty Prados. Let's go back to the J70 Light. It saw a lot of success in populated Asian and European cities, so by 1990, Toyota created the J70 Prado and canceled the J70 Light. Except at some point, I think they brought it back because if you look at the Middle East Toyota websites, you can actually still find this J70 Light available for 2024. Now, when Toyota did go to the Prados, I think one cool thing to keep in mind is that Toyota always produced a 3-door or a 5-door option for those Prados. Now, even though they had the 5-door options, those were still smaller than the station wagon series. So with the 3-door or the 5-door Prados, these were highly marketed as a city vehicle that you could still take out as that weekend warrior to go hit the mountains. So by 1996, Toyota released the second generation of the J70 Prado, and now that's called the J90. The 3-door model had a 2.7 liter 4-banger and the 5-door had a 3.4 liter V6. The same engines were actually offered in the 4Runner and the Tacoma at that time. The J90 had a front double wishbone suspension system, it had all-wheel drive and ABS. Now, if you recall, 2 years later in 1998 is when the J100 came out and it had those same upgraded features. So what this shows was that the Prado was actually helping to feed technology into the current flagship model. Another interesting thing to note about the J70 is that it actually replaced the 4Runner in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't even called the Prado in the UK. It was called the Land Cruiser Colorado. With that, let's go ahead and fast forward 7 years and we get the next generation. So now it's 2003 and Toyota released the J120. Now this J120 is still not offered in North America, but you can technically get the 5-door cousin because in the same year Lexus started producing the GX470, which some might say was actually the better vehicle because the GX470 comes standard with a V8 engine, when the J120's biggest engine was either a V6 or a straight 4 diesel. Now there's not too much to say about the J120. It stayed in production for 9 years and it remained a success in many parts of the world until we get to 2010 where we get the 4th generation. Now Toyota has released the 4th generation Prado. The J150 still had a 3-door and a 5-door option, and if you were in North America, Lexus came out with the GX460. Just like with the J200 during this decade, the J150 Prado had over 10 years of production up until 2023. So basically 13 years of lifespan, and it saw 2 refreshes during that time. There was one in 2014 and then the next one in 2018. Also, unfortunately for some people, this was the generation that started to kill off the 3-door option. Despite the roots of the Prado being the 3-door J70 Light, Times have changed. Now it looks like the next generation will not have a 3-door option at all. And which generation is that? Well, it's the one finally coming to North America. It's called the J250, and we should start seeing these at dealerships by summer of 2024, marking it as the 5th generation of Land Cruiser Prado. With the J250, we have finally covered every Land Cruiser generation for every Land Cruiser series. That's about 16 different generations when you combine all the different series, and I hope you learned as much from this video as I did, and if you appreciate content like this, please subscribe for more. Thank you, and see you next time.